I'm not afraid of any threats from a housewife like you who doesn't have a job and parents. It's true, you can't do anything with a bunch of garbage, because it's just garbage. I understand how you feel right now. I'm leaving this house, and now you're homeless. Good luck being homeless. This is a good chance for Anthony to get out of the house, so let's work together to get rid of the trash and clean up. They went to Anthony's room and told him to pack up and leave. I planned to leave alone, but I didn't think Anthony would be kicked out too. My name is Peyton, I'm 29 years old, and I'm a housewife. I recently got married to a man named Brandon. He is 33 years old, 4 years older than me. At first I thought he was mature and calm, like an older man, as he often talked about his mother. I believed that it showed his devotion to his family, that he was able to take care and protect those he loved. However, after the wedding, I saw the true essence of my husband. On our wedding day, my mother-in-law was very friendly to me, which strengthened my faith that our marriage would be happy. My husband asked me to live with his mother after we got married because his father passed away a few years ago. He said he wanted to stay by her side to take care of her. I, thinking that my mother-in-law was trustworthy and that this would be a show of care on Brandon's part, agreed. But as soon as we crossed the threshold of her house, everything changed. Both my mother-in-law and Brandon became different people. They turned me into a servant in my own house. "Hey, Peyton, hurry up and bring me tea," my mother-in-law called me in a rude tone. Her voice rang throughout the house like an alarm, demanding more and more each time. She wanted me to do everything: clean the bathroom, wash the floors, do the laundry. There was a certain coldness in her voice, an indifference that at first seemed to me just a feature of her age. But I soon realized that it was more than that. The biggest shock was the unexpected appearance of a man that no one had told me about. When I woke up one morning, I went to the kitchen and froze in amazement. A stranger was standing in front of me. His figure, which did not belong to our house, made my breathing ragged. I didn't know how to react until he noticed my surprise and introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Anthony, Brandon's younger brother." His words echoed in my head. I've never been told that my husband has a brother, let alone that he lives with us. It was overwhelming. Anthony, he said, was a recluse, and his presence in the house went unnoticed by everyone except his mother-in-law. My mother-in-law herself only waved me off when I turned to her for clarification. "Oh, Anthony. Don't worry about him. He's like a ghost, he just exists somewhere nearby." I was surprised how anyone could be so dismissive of their own son. His mother-in-law called Anthony a ghost, as if he were an invisible, useless creature who, according to her, only went shopping and spent the rest of his time hiding in his room. She did not hesitate to declare that she was happy only with Brandon, as if Anthony did not exist in her life. These words hit me, and I felt deeply disappointed in my mother-in-law. It was hard for me to believe that the kind woman who seemed caring on our wedding day had changed so much. She called Anthony a useless hermit, and I couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. As an only child, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to grow up next to my brother, but to know that your own mother rejects you as if you were insignificant. I wondered, what if my own mother, who is no longer alive, had said something like that about me? This thought pierced my heart with pain. I envied those families who were still alive and together, hoping for mutual understanding and support, even if it was a difficult relationship. When Brandon returned from work that evening, I decided to discuss Anthony. It seemed to me that the brothers could get along if they paid more attention to each other. But his reaction startled me. "Leave him alone," he said coldly, not even bothering to look in my direction. "Just pretend he doesn't exist, he won't hurt you." His words sounded dismissive, as if Anthony was some kind of inconvenient addition to their lives that he didn't even think it necessary to mention. This was not the husband I knew, or at least thought I knew. Upon hearing this, I finished my business and went upstairs, feeling deep regret for where this marriage had led me. And then I bumped into Anthony, who came out of his room, heading for the bathroom. He looked at me and said, "You're married to my brother, aren't you?" I nodded and replied quietly, "Yes, but what happened?" He stopped and, after a moment's hesitation, replied, "I'm very sorry." I didn't understand what this was about, and I asked, "What are you talking about?" His face turned serious as he said, "You should get a divorce." His words stunned me. I felt a cold shiver run through my body. How could he advise me to do that? I married Brandon because I loved him, despite all the difficulties. And now, just a few days later, his own brother advises me to end the marriage? "It's none of your business," I replied firmly, trying to keep my emotions under control. "I can handle this on my own." Anthony lowered his head and added softly, "I'm sorry for my words." I felt that he was sincere, but his advice left a deep mark on my heart. At that moment, I thought about Anthony's oddities, which my mother-in-law and Brandon constantly emphasized. Yes, he was withdrawn, unusual, but he seemed much more humane and kind than those with whom I was in this house. The next day, while I was making breakfast, Anthony came down to the kitchen to get a glass of water. "Good morning, Anthony," I said, feeling awkward from yesterday's conversation. "Why don't you join us for breakfast?" He looked at me and calmly replied, "Good morning, Peyton, thanks for the offer." But then his gaze darted to his mother, and he instantly changed. "I won't have breakfast with him," his mother-in-law said sharply, not even bothering to turn in his direction. "Just make breakfast," she shouted in my direction. Anthony just nodded, politely said, "It's all right," and went back to his room, as if his presence here was completely undesirable. I wanted to apologize to him for my harsh words yesterday, but for some reason I couldn't. At that moment, my mother-in-law turned to me with a cold look, as if she was reproaching me for talking to her son at all. "Hey, your job is just housework. Don't do anything superfluous, okay?" That tone, that sharp order, startled me. Wasn't I a daughter-in-law? Didn't she deserve basic respect? But all this paled before the scene that unfolded in the evening. Brandon was annoyed when he got home. "What the hell is today's menu? Curry? Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "I've already had curry for lunch," he shouted, as if it was my fault. I stood in front of him, stunned by his accusations, not understanding why he didn't just call and warn me in advance if it was so important to him. I was silent, trying to hold back the tears, but everything was boiling inside. Brandon continued to yell at me, as if he didn't notice my condition. His voice, calm and even icy, only intensified the pain. "Hey, you didn't even apologize. Why do you think you're here? Your job is to do the housework, so make sure you understand that." His words were like whips. I could feel each one of them cutting through my heart. I was shocked. How could he be so cruel? Does he really not care what happens to me? It wasn't the Brandon I fell in love with. Now he turned into a man who just needed a housekeeper, not a wife. He didn't take care of me, as I once hoped, but only used me to provide comfort for himself and his mother. At that moment, I felt like I was out of place in this house. They giggled and watched TV in the living room, as if my pain was non-existent to them. I went upstairs to hide from their indifference, but as soon as I closed the door behind me, tears began to flow. It seemed that my body was shaking with sobs when I suddenly felt someone's gentle hand on my shoulder. She handed me a handkerchief. "It's time for you to leave," a familiar voice sounded. I looked up to see who it was. Anthony was standing in front of me. His face expressed sympathy and sadness. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I quickly wiped away my tears and hurriedly muttered, "I'm sorry I used your handkerchief." But Anthony answered softly, "I gave it to you because I wanted you to use it." His words sounded so sincere that I couldn't help but feel grateful. "I heard what my brother and mother were saying," Anthony continued, his voice low but determined. "I knew they were like that. Always have been." His confession stunned me. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling that he might know more than he seemed at first glance. Anthony sighed, as if gathering his thoughts, and told me a story that took my breath away. My husband, it turns out, was engaged to another woman before he met me. She was supposed to be his wife, but like me, she was trapped in family manipulation. My mother-in-law and Brandon treated her the same way they treat me now. She ran away right before the wedding, unable to withstand the pressure and cruelty she faced every day. This story made me feel a little relieved. I realized that I had not been alone in my suffering all this time. But with that came the realization that my husband and mother-in-law were pretending to be good people just to lure me into their trap. Now I couldn't trust them. But despite this realization, I had no choice. Where could I go? I have no family left to rely on. I was just a housewife, dependent on the will of my husband and his mother, who would not allow me to get even a part-time job. Move to another place? I could only dream about it. All my hopes were ruined, and the only thing left was to cry. Anthony, noticing my tears, said softly, "If we keep talking here, it might seem suspicious. Let's meet at the cafe next time, if you want." His voice was warm and his eyes were full of understanding. He handed me a piece of paper with his contact information and went to his room. I watched him go, feeling a determination building inside me. I had to find a way out. My survival in this house was becoming a struggle, and I realized that this was just the beginning. The next day, I announced to my mother-in-law that I needed to go to the city office. Of course, she immediately warned me not to leave any chores around the house before leaving. I tried to do everything perfectly. I washed the floors, cleaned the kitchen, checked all the little things. But even that didn't get me out of her grumbling. "If you're late for dinner, don't wait for me," she said reproachfully, to which I just nodded, pretending to agree. On the way home, I stopped at a cafe where I was supposed to meet Anthony. Anxiety was raging inside me. When he came, I told him everything, that my parents had left, and that I no longer had anyone I could rely on. I gave up my rented apartment and quit my job for a marriage that was now crumbling. "I need to start over," I whispered, feeling a growing desperation. Housework kept me tied to my mother-in-law and husband from morning until late at night. There seemed to be no way out. "Peyton, can you draw?" Anthony asked suddenly. I looked at him in surprise, not understanding what this question was about. "What do you mean?" I muttered in confusion. "Well, you went to art school, didn't you?" he asked with a smile. I nodded, wondering what would come of it. "That's great!" Anthony exclaimed, his face beaming. "The fact is that one famous artist is now looking for an assistant. This is a job that can be done remotely." But then I added sadly, "I don't have a computer. I sold it when we moved here." Anthony thought for a moment, and then suggested, "I can lend you mine. I'm not using it now anyway." Anthony looked at me with a smile and replied, "Thank you so much for your concern, but I actually have an extra computer." His words caused me involuntary surprise, and I immediately asked, "What do you do for a living anyway?" Anthony was slightly embarrassed, but continued with a slight grin, "It's very kind of you to ask. You don't think I'm just a hermit sitting around, do you?" I smiled, watching his manner of communication. He was really friendly and tidy, although his appearance gave away that he spent a lot of time at home. "No, no," I laughed. "You always say such polite words and look so neat that it's hard for me to imagine you doing nothing. But to be honest, I don't think you work from home." Anthony nodded, understanding where I was going. "Well, I'm actually an engineer," he said, and I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "An engineer?" "I didn't know," I exclaimed, no longer hiding my surprise. "Yes, I used to work for a large company, but now I run my own business," he explained. "Now I can take orders myself, and I have several employees, including web designers. Everything is done remotely, so I can afford to work from home." That's why you're here all the time, I finally understood. But your mom and Brandon keep saying that you're just at home and not doing anything. You told them the truth, didn't you? Anthony smiled thoughtfully and replied, I don't see any point in telling them the truth. They won't appreciate or understand anyway. His words were soaked with fatigue, but he had clearly come to terms with it a long time ago. But one thing I couldn't understand was, if you're so successful, why don't you just leave this house? Anthony was silent for a moment, obviously thinking about my words, but then, as if taking the conversation away from himself, he said, Let's not talk about me. I need to introduce you to a manga artist. This is really more important. With that, he took out his phone and called someone. Everything happened so fast that I barely had time to realize what was happening. A remote interview with this artist was scheduled for me, and it was supposed to take place on Wednesday. Wednesday turned out to be the perfect day, as my mother-in-law usually attended her classes, after which she went for a walk with other participants. It gave me enough time for an interview. I was tense, but I was ready for the meeting. The interview went better than I expected. It looks like I made a good impression, and I was hired right away. Given my difficult situation, they were ready to send all the necessary documents by mail, addressing them to Anthony in order to avoid suspicion from my husband and mother-in-law. The next step was to find a new place to stay. Anthony offered to help. I have a friend who works at a real estate agency. He can offer you a good deal. At that moment, I felt that perhaps the light at the end of the tunnel was beginning to break through the darkness. We started looking for a place to live, and thanks to Anthony, everything went smoothly. We quickly found an apartment that met my needs and signed a lease. However, just as it seemed that everything was starting to get better, something happened that brought me back to reality. One night, after midnight, my husband returned home, being slightly drunk. He burst into the bedroom, waking me up. Hey! Where's dinner? His voice was hoarse and irritated. I was stunned by his tone. It's midnight, I said, trying to stay calm. Besides, you said yourself that you didn't want to eat because you were going to drink. But he didn't seem to hear my words. Shut up! He shouted, clenching his fists. The king of the house has returned, and you don't even get up to greet him. And I didn't cook dinner. You're a useless wife. His words fueled my rage. I felt like everything was boiling inside. Do you have any idea how hard it is for me? I work for you and your mother, and you act like you're above me. My attempt to explain didn't make sense. He just laughed grimly. You are my wife. A wife must support her husband and take care of the house. If you can't handle your responsibilities, don't you dare cross me. A wife who can't handle household chores is just trash. His words hit me with such force that I couldn't believe what was happening. At that moment, I heard the door open. It was my mother-in-law. She entered the room and, without saying a word, stood as a silent witness to our quarrel. You're just trash, my husband continued. And Anthony is the same trash. This house looks like a dump. I couldn't stand it. What did you just say? I asked, but he was already rummaging through his desk drawer. Then he took out a paper and handed it to me. That's what I mean, these are the divorce papers. I don't need you anymore. I'll find another wife to take your place. Pack up and get out of my house. I hope one day you'll regret what you just said, I said calmly, despite the fact that everything was raging inside me. But his face was distorted by a contemptuous smile. He did not even try to hide his superiority. What are you trying to say? His voice was full of cynicism. I'm not afraid of any threats from a housewife who has no job or parents. His laughter echoed in the room, and his mother-in-law joined him, giggling at my situation. They laughed as if I were just an object of ridicule, an insignificant figure whose voice doesn't matter. It's true, there's nothing you can do about it, because you're trash, my husband continued, his words hitting like slaps in the face. I understand how you feel, I said, fighting back tears as I headed for the exit. I'm leaving this house, I said decisively, signing the divorce papers. Their gloating faces, full of self-satisfaction, will remain in my memory forever. I took the documents and started packing my things. The room was quiet except for the muffled whispers coming from my tormentors. Now you're homeless, I heard my mother-in-law's mocking voice. What are you going to do? Where are you going? She enjoyed every second of my humiliation with pleasure. Well, it's not our business anymore. Good luck to you, homeless lady, the husband added, laughing strangled. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Everything that I once thought of as my home now seemed like a strange, hostile place. Oh, and Anthony. Her mother-in-law suddenly interrupted, her voice filled with a sarcastic intonation. Now it's time for him to leave. Let's take out the trash, and then we'll clean up, she said with a grin. I felt a wave of anger wash over me. After we get rid of it, we can demolish this wall and make the living room bigger and more comfortable, the husband continued, already discussing plans to rebuild the house. As if by agreement, they went to Anthony's room. Pack your things and get out, they told him, without giving him a chance to talk. I froze, clenching my teeth when I heard that. I expected them to kick me out, but I never thought they'd kick Anthony out too. When they left, I went to Anthony, feeling guilty that my actions had led to this. I'm sorry, Anthony. It's all my fault, I said, lowering my eyes, unable to meet his gaze. But his voice was calm. Don't worry about it, he replied softly, and his warm smile gave me some hope back. I realized a long time ago that I don't want to live with them anymore. Besides, I have my own business and interests. Perhaps it's even better that we quarreled. A few days later, on Wednesday, when my mother-in-law left town, Anthony and I took advantage of the moment and called the transport company. We moved in, and by the time it was over, I finally felt a little relieved. My new life was beginning. I was in a new home, away from oppression and pain, and it was only thanks to Anthony that I managed to find the strength to take this step. I felt a certain calmness in my new place, although the old fears still haunted me. One day my mother-in-law tried to call. The phone suddenly rang, its sound cut through my nerves, as if it were a danger signal. I realized that I had forgotten to block her number, and I saw no other way out but to answer. Peyton, where are you? A familiar voice sounded. He was full of tension and perseverance. I held my breath before replying, there's no way I'm going to tell you where I am. You and I are strangers now. But there was something strange in her voice that alerted me. Please don't say that, she begged, her tone changing to soft, almost broken. I'm calling because, where's Anthony? She finally asked. My anger flared up anew. Why is it so important for her to know where Anthony is? Why are you asking about Anthony? I asked, already feeling anger rising inside me. I've been looking for him, but I can't contact him anymore. This is very bad. Her voice sounded increasingly desperate. Maybe he just doesn't like you anymore? I decided to provoke her, feeling grim satisfaction at her confusion. But suddenly another voice, rougher and more demanding, picked up the phone. Don't be silly, you two moved out together. You must know where he is. You're just a bunch of jerks. I knew where Anthony was, but I wasn't going to tell them. Their persistence did not deserve my response, and I was ready to close this chapter of my life. I'm afraid I don't know, you'll have to find it yourself, I said in a calm voice. There was an irritated sniff from the other side of the phone, followed by rude, contemptuous words. Where the hell are you anyway? You don't have a home, a job, or a place to live. If you're willing to beg, I could let you come back. But you'll have to be my housekeeper. I grinned, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction at her desperation. Who will come back to you? I replied with a cold sneer. I have a job and a place to live. I'm not coming back to you." My voice was as firm as it had ever been before, and that certainty infuriated her. "It's a lie," she screamed, unable to believe my words. I heard my ex-husband, who was standing somewhere nearby, whispering in amazement. He was amazed at how quickly I managed to sort everything out. But I didn't bother to correct them, continuing to say, "Please don't call me anymore. If you call or try to approach me, I will contact the police." Without waiting for an answer, I hung up and immediately blocked her number. It was just a formality. All ties with the previous life were finally severed. My ex-husband's number was blocked even earlier. I knew that their panic was caused by one simple realization. They finally realized something important. They had always believed that the inheritance left by their father-in-law would ensure their future, but now that Anthony had stopped sending money, they began to realize the truth. All my life, my mother-in-law considered Anthony a lazy, unpromising person, incapable of anything but idleness. And now, when the money stopped coming in at the expected time, they must have finally realized that it was Anthony who had been providing for their lives all this time. When Anthony was expelled from home, all his ties with his mother and brother were cut off. He stopped supporting them financially, and they were left with nothing. My ex-husband did not have his own funds to pay alimony, and my mother-in-law lived only on the money that Anthony regularly sent every month. Now that the money flows have dried up, she is in serious trouble. The irony of the situation was that they both got what they deserved. I didn't feel sorry for them at all. By the way, Anthony, meanwhile, bought himself a luxury apartment in New York and now lived there, enjoying comfort and independence. Why is he so rich? This question probably still tormented them. Why has he been sending money to his parents all this time, despite their attitude? The answer was simple. Anthony had made a promise to his father. Anthony's father was a kind man, and he sincerely loved his son, despite the fact that his wife and another son treated him badly. Before his death, Anthony's father asked for one last favor. "You may not like your mother and brother, but they are important family members to me. Please take care of them after my death." Anthony, despite all the bullying, kept his promise and all these years secretly sent money to his mother and brother to support them. It was his way of keeping his promise to his father, even if no one knew the truth. But the most terrible thing about the whole story was that Anthony's mother and brother, having kicked him out of the house, never found out the truth. They considered him a lazy, useless man, not realizing that it was he who provided their lives. It was terribly unfair, but Anthony accepted it. When I met him after we moved in, he told me about this promise, and I understood why he stayed in this house for so long. I agreed with his choice, although it hurt me to see how such a kind-hearted man was forced to live among those who did not appreciate him. My life started to get better after the divorce, and I was grateful to Anthony for his support. He became an important person to me, and I believe that our friendship was a source of strength that helped me through difficult times. 2 years after we moved in, Anthony proposed to me. He asked me to marry him, and although this is a completely different story, this moment was an important milestone in my life. We got married, and my life was filled with happiness and tranquility. I had overcome all the difficulties and obstacles, and now happiness was in my hands. I am grateful for Anthony and for the days we spent together.